appreciate that. And look, whatever the deficiencies in U.S. policy have been over the years, I think it is fair to say that we are reorienting our policy in a way that is more in tune with what the Tibetan community wants. And I just want to say that we're working on a bill that we'll be introducing soon to help the U.S. government counter Chinese disinformation on Tibet and ensure that U.S. policy supports the basis for the Dalai Lama's quest for genuine autonomy, and also making it clear that facts matter, and that you can't rewrite history because because you want to. I mean, history is history, facts are facts, so again, I think that there is a renewed interest in the United States and in other countries around the world. As we witnessed yesterday, talking to parliamentarians from all over the world who are in Washington to find ways to support the Tibetan people, that I think things are changing globally, and I wish they had changed a long time ago, but they're now changing. My time is up right now. I'm going to recognize Senator Ossoff.
Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panelists. I'd like to ask each of our panelists to comment on the intersection of press freedom and the issue at hand today. Last week in the commission, we heard from Undersecretary Zaya, who committed to me to work with my office to expand press freedom internationally and strengthen U.S. leadership for press freedom. My question, please, beginning with you, Mr. Tong, is how does the CCP repress freedom of reporting and publication within Tibet, more broadly within China? How does the CCP seek to influence reporting and publication on related issues internationally? And when you're concluded, we can move to Ms. Bork. I'd like to hear from each panelist on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. There are no press freedoms in Tibet or in any of the Tibetan areas within the PRC. And no foreign journalists are allowed to visit Tibet freely. Very rarely and occasionally, groups of Western journalists who are stationed in Beijing might be allowed on a short trip that is fully managed by Chinese officials. So as with regard to press freedom, I think Tibet is regarded as one of the worst, even worse than North Korea, according to Freedom House, I believe. So we are only able to get news items, news reports through personal contacts of Tibetans who are in exile and occasionally through social media.
Thank you, Ms. Bork.
I certainly concur with what Mr. Tethong has said. I think it's important to think about the way China is, projecting its and challenging norms of freedoms. And we have to be really very attuned to the way they present, the way they treat rights, but the way they'd like to alter the way the world respects universal norms. So I don't have anything to add about inside Tibet, but I would be very alert to the way they talk about, the way Chinese Communist Party's officials talk about democratic norms, including press freedom, and try to shape them, particularly in countries where they have a great deal of influence or where they're trying to acquire influence.
Thank you. Mr. Alban-Prague.
Yes, I don't have anything to add about the press freedom or the lack of it in Tibet. What I would say is that at the same time, China is, in a sense, abusing the freedom of the press internationally, outside of China, by using the press very actively to project its narrative on Tibet, to project also its vocabulary on Tibet. For example, many members of the press write articles in which they refer to Tibetans as a minority, one of China's minorities, which is an implicit acceptance of Tibet being part of China and the Tibetans being one of China's peoples, minorities. Whereas in effect, the Tibetans are not a minority. They are the population of Tibet. They are the people of Tibet, and they are a people under international law with the full right to self-determination. And so that's just one example, but there's so many examples of articles in the press and reports in the press that use Chinese terminology in regard to Tibet.
Thank you. Ms. Lowe.
Thank you. I'm not an expert in this area and have nothing of value to add, but I would like to use this opportunity to emphasize something else that was brought up just now. China or the Qing Empire never had any power in selecting the Dalai Lama, and that's clearly reflected in the official Chinese records. The Qing Empire only made a request to the Tibetans to use a golden urn to do one minor step of the selection by drawing lots, and that was all. And even that request was not consistently followed or acceded by the Tibetan authorities during the Qing dynasty. Thank you.
Thank you all for your responses. Thank you for the additional context and information. I worked prior to my election producing investigative reports of crimes, official corruption, crimes against humanity, and freedom of press and freedom of publication are under attack worldwide. The United States government must strengthen and redouble its commitment to stand as vanguard for press freedom around the world, and to our hearing will help inform our efforts to that end. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator. Congresswoman Steele.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Every person has the right to religious and cultural beliefs, and all governments, including the CCP, have no right to restrict this fundamental belief. It is inexcusable that the people of Tibet are not free and are currently met with punishment ranging from warnings and surveillance to interrogation and detention. We cannot sit while Tibetans are being detained and imprisoned for political and religious reasons. And I was honored to meet His Holiness the Dalai Lama in my district, and we have to make the world know leaders of Tibet cannot go back to his own country and his own people because of CCP oppression. With that, to all the witnesses, with the current abuses by CCP to oppress autonomous regions, what should the United States and other countries to do stand with the Tibet people and working? I'm just asking all the witnesses, so anybody wants to answer, love to hear that. And can global corporate play a role in raising awareness about the Tibet oppression? That's what I asked last year before the Winter Olympic, and I wanted these corporations that spend billions and billions of dollars in advertising, they can use their platform to know, but I didn't get any responses, from any of those 17 in the Olympic sponsored corporations. So could you let me know? You can start with, I guess, Ms. Bork.
I'm so sorry. If someone else could start, please. I'm having trouble hearing.
Yeah, Congresswoman, if you could just repeat the crux of your question again, because it kind of went in and out.
So. With the current abuses by CCP to oppress autonomous regions, what should the United States and other countries work together to stand with the Tibet people? And can global corporate companies play a role in raising awareness about the Tibet oppression?
Thank you very much for the question. I think international solidarity and coordination on all these points is vital, given the parties' adept use of tools like financial diplomacy and propaganda and various other kinds of intimidation. Not to mention, we haven't even talked about how China continues to redefine Tibet to the point that it is referring to Northeast India as southern Tibet. So this is very much an ongoing issue that requires staunch and coordinated reply. There was an interesting proposal unrelated to Tibet from a fellow in Scandinavia about an economic Article 5 for NATO. I think it's certainly worth discussing the kind of retaliation that countries could experience if they take a more, not forceful, but a more thoughtful and principled stance on Tibet. You really can't prepare enough for that eventuality. And I'd certainly recommend that Congress think about that as well. As for global companies, they haven't really, I guess I'm too negative. I only know the bad examples. Maybe someone else knows some good examples of companies on Tibet. But I do think that attitude is changing as a result of the Olympics and some other, the NBA and things like that. I think, unfortunately, there's still a market for companies to kowtow out of the Chinese line on Tibet and other issues, but I do think it's changing and people are more sensitive to that. So I'm a little more optimistic than I might have once been.
Thank you. Any other witnesses?
I would like to make two observations that follow on what Ellen Bork has just mentioned. Regarding cooperation among countries, I think it's also very important to emphasize that not only is this of crucial importance for Tibet and the Tibetan people themselves, but this has broader international ramifications because the appeasement of China on Tibet for the past 70 years is not unrelated to China's expansion today or its efforts to expand in the South China Sea, where it uses a similar historical narrative as it does to claim sovereignty over Tibet, and its aggressive stance in relation to northern India, both in the eastern and western part of northern India, and as Ellen Bork mentioned, even calling one part of northeast India southern Tibet, where it makes territorial claims, again, directly related to its historical narrative of Tibet. So one cannot accept the historical narrative on Tibet and then contest China's claim to northern India, or perhaps even it makes it difficult to contest their claim to the South China Sea islands. And the second question regarding corporations, the only thing I would mention is that, again, under international law, because China is denying the Tibetan people their right to self-determination, which they have, and because it is occupying Tibet, corporations and governments are forbidden from benefiting from the exploitations of resources in Tibet, because those resources, under international law, belong to the Tibetan people. And therefore, they cannot be exploited, one cannot benefit from it without the express permission of the Tibetan people given freely. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those answers. And the CCP continues to have oversight of Tibetan religious life by mandating political education for monks and nuns, creating apparatus to surveil and manage monastic institutions. Can you expand more on how the CCP authorities continue to reorient Tibetan society? I think maybe Professor Mao.
Actually, I would like to comment on the earlier topic that you brought up. I think it's important for the world to realize that the Tibet issue is not necessarily just a China issue. I read in the mainstream newspaper articles in the past several days that they have pointed out that Putin is going to recreate the old Russian Empire by bringing up all this historical justification of sort of territorial rights even over the Baltic nations. If you look at the Chinese records clearly show that Tibet wasn't part of China, but it does indicate that Burma and Korea and Thailand and Laos and a whole bunch of these areas were clearly part of China. It also indicates that even countries like Holland and Portugal were tributary countries to China. So as we have seen what has developed in the Putin's and in Ukraine's case, if we do not explicitly reject this kind of an attitude, there is always a possibility, a strong possibility, that 20 years from now, when China becomes even stronger, then they're going to bring up these old claims of sovereignty over Korea and over Vietnam, and then, as I've said, even over Portugal. And I think that's the point that I would like to make. Thank you.
I would just like to add a comment that, yes, it is on. For the last 20 or 30 years, global attention to what is happening in Tibet, and especially concerns expressed by the United States Congress, has had a tremendous impact in the situation in Tibet. I think the rights of the Tibetan people and the safety of the Tibetan people to a great degree has been provided simply because the outside world is looking, and especially the United States is watching. For a long-term sort of goal to help and resolve the Tibet issue, I think, as my co-panelists have said, we should not look at Tibet and the Tibetan people as a sort of a unique element on their own, but that this is an issue that concerns the whole world. And when we deal with any development in Tibet, of course, we are going to look at it from the human rights of an individual Tibetan. Therefore, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is should be a central theme to work with. And along with that, as far as the Tibetan people are concerned, their right to self-determination should be an underlying feature of how we deal with Tibet in the future.
I totally agree with Professor Lau, because China is one of the biggest threats in the whole world. And if we don't stop right now on their CCP's invasion and oppression to autonomous regions, then you know what? In 20 years, the kind of map that we're going to have. So this is a very important meeting. I really appreciate that we can have and we can really hear from witnesses. Thank you for coming out, and I yield that.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So I have a series of questions, and I'm going to get through them all, and so bear with me here. So, Mr. Van Walt, your testimony addresses the concept of self-determination as core to your thesis. Can you discuss the gap, if any, between the basis of the right to self-determination in international law and the extent to which governments honor and protect that right? And how would you respond to those who say Tibetans are not entitled to self-determination?
Thank you very much for the question. Self-determination under international law is a basic right. It is both a basic right and it is codified in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in its very first article, because there is a recognition, and there was a recognition when those two conventions were written, that without honoring the right to self-determination, many of the other human rights are difficult to conceive of and to respect. And therefore it is dependent to some degree on respecting the right to self-determination. But self-determination is also a fundamental principle of international relations, as many UN declarations make clear that respect for the right to self-determination is a fundament of friendly relations among states. And so both these things are truly fundamental. At the same time, self-determination as it has developed was for a long time considered to be primarily a right of countries to decolonize from Western colonialism. But increasingly it is being recognized that when we're speaking about colonialism, we're speaking about the nature of rule, the nature of the relationship between a dominant power and a subjugated country, a subjugated people under alien domination. And regardless of whether it is a Western power, regardless of whether there is an ocean between the, if you like, the cosmopolitan country and the colony, colonialism is about the nature of relations and exploitation. Under that concept, Tibet very clearly is under colonial rule today. And I think it should be recognized that way. The PRC just introduced this at an earlier session of the Human Rights Council in Geneva, a resolution on the continuing, and I don't know the exact words, but something like the continuing consequences of colonialism. Even within that context, we should be using colonialism to address the situation in Tibet. Aside from colonialism, Tibetans also, because they are a people under any definition in international law of a people with the right to self-determination, Tibetans fit squarely in that category. In terms of the difference between, in other words, their right to full self-determination and the honoring of that internationally, there is, I think, a big gap. In the 1950s and 60s, a number of countries, including the United States, recognized and supported the Tibetan people's right to self-determination. And as you know, there is a United Nations General Assembly resolution on that subject in 1960 that recognizes the Tibetans' right to self-determination and calls on for its respect and for its implementation. So Tibetans have had that recognition internationally. The discrepancy is that today many countries, probably most countries, do not refer to the Tibetan people's right to self-determination anymore, simply out of fear of displeasing China. And I think it is very important to restore the situation to where it was universally recognized that Tibetans had the right to self-determination.
Thank you. Ms. Bork, you have written about how democracy should be a component of our policy on Tibet, keeping in mind that the CTA has established a democratic form of government in exile. The Biden administration has created a process to prioritize this issue called the Summit for Democracy. And as I understand it, the CTA was not involved in the first summit meeting last December. Would you recommend that the administration include the CTA in the upcoming summit this December? And if so, how?
I would very strongly recommend that. It seems to me it would be a great oversight to continue to neglect this achievement, especially if the administration is trying to develop support for the reincarnation as an element of essentially liberal democracy and liberal democratic norms being respected, human rights, and so forth. So yes, I strongly do that. I don't see any reason, I don't know the sort of governing basis for inclusion. Whatever it is, it can include representatives of a democratically elected body, even if they are not a sovereign country. So I hope so.
Thank you. Mr. Thetong, you have firsthand experience dealing with Chinese interlocutors, including during your participation in a fact-finding delegation to Tibet. What perspective can you provide on the Chinese attitude toward dialogue with the the Dalai Lama?
Mr. Chairman, I think through the interactions we've had with the delegations that visited Tibet in the 80s, I was a part of one of the groups, and the later interactions with the envoys I've had, which has been very extensive, although the Chinese government brought the process to an end, we know that during that process, many key officials in the Chinese government and in the United Front officials became fully aware of, mention the misrule in Tibet, and also fully aware of what Tibetan intentions, what Tibetan hopes and aspirations were. And so there is, within the Chinese government and leadership, I think, a full understanding of where the Tibetans stand and where they could make accommodations for. It's not as though the Chinese leadership is ignorant about the real situation. So while on one level it seems like the negotiations have stopped, we know that there are elements within the Chinese leadership and the Chinese government who can, given maybe the right circumstances, take up Tibet once again. So this process and the possibility of dialogue, renewed dialogue, and an initiative from the Chinese side, I think remains very possible.
And Professor Lau, are the maps and documents that you cite available in archives inside of China? And do researchers and historians in China have access to the information? And to what extent is this information digitized and online or otherwise available at libraries outside of China?
Thank you for your question. But please allow me to answer a preceding question.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I want to add to what Michael had said about self-determination. The Chinese Communist Party, in the earlier version of the party constitution in the 1930s, repeatedly affirmed the self-determination rights of the so-called minorities with explicit sentence stating that up to the level of independence and seceding from China. In other words, they practically advocate, if not at least agree to the rights of the Tibetans and, well, actually the Xinjiang Uyghurs too, to form independent countries. They only deleted those clauses after they gained power after 1949. Is that okay? Now to answer your question. Actually, in my book, which is written in Chinese, and my target audience is people in China, I wanted to sort of convince the people in China that they haven't done the right thing with respect to Tibet. So I have actually taken totally Chinese chauvinistic approach. I dismiss all Tibetan records. I dismiss all Western records. I only use Chinese records that are authored by Chinese, written in the Chinese language from the 13th century up till 1949, before the Chinese Communist Party took power. And I also restrict myself to only these old records that were reprinted by the People's Republic of China, indicating their acceptance of the authoritativeness of these publications. And yes, most of them are digitized by companies or libraries under the PRC rule. And I think actually 80% of them are not only available and digitized, they are available free of charge in public websites. And I very explicitly tell my readers, don't believe in a single word that is in this book. Go to the internet and check it up yourself. The two maps that I'm showing over here, they are available for free on websites. Many of them operated within the PRC. Many of them operated by official units of the PRC.
So maybe President Xi ought to visit the library or go online.
Well,
I just want to make sure. Congresswoman Steele, I don't know if you have an additional question. I see you're still on the line, but do you have additional questions?
No, I don't.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I just love to listen.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Benwald, what other governments have made statements about Tibet being part of China? I mean, how many also say since ancient times? Can you provide examples of how the Chinese narrative has been embraced by the international community?
I can't give you exact numbers of how many governments have and how many governments have not. I know that some governments, and I know that because I've spoken to their officials, have been very careful not to make any explicit statements, despite pressure. Others have been pressured, especially after, for example, somebody high up in the government, the Minister of Foreign Affairs or the Prime Minister, has received His Holiness the Dalai Lama. After that, they're subjected to a tremendous amount of pressure, and a number of them then make a statement to the effect that they recognize or that they identify Tibet as a part of the PRC. A good example of that is France, which after President Sarkozy, in his capacity of President of the European Union, met with His Holiness in Poland, France was put under a lot of pressure and made a statement that since the time of Charles de Gaulle, France recognized that Tibet was a part of China, which is actually not true, or not accurate, I should say. But that is an example, and that this the statement continues by saying, "And this will not change." Denmark was pressured to make a similar statement, and Denmark added that the Danish government does not support Tibetan independence. A little bit in the same way as President Obama added that statement as well. I think that addition is even more harmful and completely unnecessary. It takes away and violates the Tibetans' right to self-determination, to say that they cannot have any say in their future because we do not support a particular outcome. And again, it reduces the leverage for Tibetans should negotiations take place, this type of statement.
Thank you. And I think our position is that Tibet's true representatives are the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan government in exile, as recognized by the Tibetan people. And that is the direction that our government should follow, as well as other governments around the world. Let me, Mr. Thetong, the position of the Central Tibetan Administration is that the middle way approach proposed by the Dalai Lama is the only viable solution to the Tibet problem. And would you characterize the Chinese government's response to the Tibetan position as their disagreement that the middle way approach is viable, or is it a denial that there's even a Tibetan problem at all?
That's a difficult question to answer. It seems very complicated. I couldn't understand what you were saying, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Anyway, I mean, I guess the question is, again, that His Holiness outlined this middle way approach, the Chinese government is, hasn't responded, right? The question is it that they cannot see themselves getting to the middle way approach, or is it basically they feel they don't have to because there isn't a Tibetan issue they have to deal with?
I think it may be more of a lack of confidence on their part in how to deal with the Tibet issue, afraid that if they are able to make given to Tibetan to the Tibetans, other issues will arise within China, although the Tibetan situation is not entirely comparable to any others, but that may be one reason. And the basic reason I think I tried to point out earlier is that within the Chinese leadership, from a position of being confident and trying to find a solution during Hoya Bangai, Deng Xiaoping's time, it has retreated into another direction, and we may have, this middle way policy may have suffered that situation.
And I apologize, I just have a few more questions. I just think it's important to establish a full record here. Yes. Not only for the commission, but for my colleagues. Ms. Bork, there have been many meetings between U.S. presidents and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Would you say that these meetings have strengthened the hand of the Dalai Lama vis-a-vis China? And if President Biden were to meet with His Holiness during his term, what would you advise him to say?
I think the reception by U.S. presidents of the Dalai Lama has been extremely important, and also because it's become so regular, it would be wonderful for President Biden to be able to visit with the Dalai Lama, or if travel for either one of them were a problem, having a vice president call on His Holiness would signal American support in an effort to restore some of the break down some of the isolation that His Holiness has experienced from over years. What should he say? I think it's very much a part of the broader U.S. policy toward China. The democratic basis of government for Tibet and China should be the U.S. president seeks, and committing to that and committing to support Tibetan democracy in exile, but also Tibetan democracy eventually and Chinese democracy under whatever arrangement most people can agree on should be the goal. I don't see any problem with the United States standing. In fact, I think it's imperative.
Thank you. Professor Lau, Mr. Van Walt's books argue that it is inappropriate, if I'm mischaracterizing your books, correct me, that it is inappropriate to apply the modern definition of sovereignty to Tibet and its neighbors because ruling powers in East Asia related to each other in ways that were distinct from the Western notion of sovereignty, that was applied later. Does your research conform to this view, and how would you characterize Tibet's relations with its neighbors over the centuries?
Thank you for the question. As far as I could tell, there are many places where in the Chinese official records, many entities were referred to as countries, which is in Chinese, Guo, the country, and Tibet was also referred to as a country, Guo, just like Vietnam and just like Holland and these other countries. So now, if you look at the history of Tibet over the past 1,000 years, they are not that dissimilar or that different from the histories of Germany or China or whatever. And there's at some time there was unified into a central administration, and at other times it was fragmented, and there were all these principalities, and so I guess your question itself would take hours to debate, and I'm not good enough to answer the question. Certainly, by the Qing Empire's time, well, actually even before that, I think by the 15th to the 16th century, Tibet became sufficiently unified, and they had all the structure of a government, such as legal codes, taxation, central taxation, so forth, that would qualify to be a country. But I have always felt that that's, pardon me for saying this, it's a less relevant question. The more relevant question is that, was Tibet part of China? And if Tibet wasn't part of China, to put it bluntly, it's really none of your business whether Tibet itself was a country. And so on one hand, I would say, yes, Tibet was definitely a country compared to the standards that would be applicable to China and Germany since the 15th century or so. But again, I want to repeat that that's probably an unnecessary sort of confusion to the issue. The more important issue is that nobody has the right to judge whether Tibet was a country. The more important thing was that was Tibet part of somebody else's territory, and if it's not, then leave Tibet alone.
Thank you for clarifying all that for us. Let me ask one other question, and then this is to everybody here. I mean, in any closing remarks that you want to make. You know, in May, in a May press conference with the Japanese Prime Minister, President Biden said, "I believe what Putin is attempting to do is eliminate the identity of Ukraine, the identity. He can't occupy it, but he can try to destroy its identity." And, you know, I think those words are true with what Putin is trying to do in Ukraine, but I think they're also applicable to what China is trying to do in Tibet. I mean, when we visited Lhasa back in 2015 with Speaker Pelosi, it is clear what they're trying to do: deny Tibetans the access to their religion, prevent them from speaking their language, honoring their customs, you know, being who they are. And they're doing it in 1,000 different ways. And displacing people. It really is quite horrific what is going on. The brutality is really horrific. But, you know, how should we view Tibet through the lens of what President Biden's comment about eliminating the identity of Ukraine? And I will ask you all to respond, and anything that you think we should add for the record, this is the time to make that clear as well. So why don't we begin with Mr. Van Walt?
Thank you very much, sir. I think what is happening in the Ukraine, Russia's war with the Ukraine, is bringing home a number of issues that are directly related to Tibet as well. I mean, we are obviously shocked by the blatant aggression against the Ukraine and reminded that exactly the same happened a little over 70 years in relation to Tibet. And President Biden also made a statement to the effect that taking another's territory by force is unacceptable, that it violates fundamental norms of our international order. I couldn't agree more. And I think that should apply to Tibet. In terms of the destruction of the very identity of the Tibetans, and I believe the same is true when we look at the Uyghurs in East Turkestan, it has become very clear, I think, at this point, that the very policy of the PRC and of the Chinese Communist Party is precisely this: to destroy the identity of these peoples, because they have found them to be an obstacle to their full integration in China. And not only that, but they have found that as long as there is a sense of identity in the Tibetan case and in the Uyghur case, both very closely linked to their religious beliefs and traditions, that the CCP will not be able to fully control the Tibetans. This is linked also to the question of the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. It is all of Chinese policies today under Xi Jinping are geared at full and total control of the Tibetans, whether it is through the Dalai Lama by picking him and educating him in accordance with CCP views, or whether it is by taking the children and placing them in this network of colonial schools, or whether it is by suppressing religious freedom and other things as well. So yes, it is, the intention is to rub Tibet out of the map in terms of the identity and the distinctness of the Tibetan people. As part of that, there is a strong effort to rob the Tibetans also of their history, since that's also tied to their identity and is a continuing embarrassment to China's attempt to continue to rule Tibet.
Slow.
Well, I would like to reiterate 2 points. The first point is that I hope the United States and other governments would sort of counter and directly the claims of some of these empire revivalists, and we are seeing that, of course, in Putin's case, and then very likely a few years later we'll see that explicitly expressed in China, that they can use historical fabrications to sort of justify their attempts to reunify ancestral lands. And that really comes to the second point, and that is I hope that in future in schools throughout the world, that people will try to change this ingrained perception, and I know very much it is very deeply ingrained in Chinese like us, and that it's very important for you to be a national of a big country, of a powerful country. They somehow believe that that is essential to the well-being. My background is that I was born in Singapore, and of course I've seen countries like Liechtenstein and Switzerland, and people in Singapore and Liechtenstein, they have no interest in enlarging the country, and people can live very well. But people who are educated in Russia and China, it never came to their mind that they could live happily ever after if they lose Xinjiang or Ukraine or Tibet or whatever it is. They think it's the end of the world if our country, is splintered and then Tibet is gone and then Xinjiang is gone. I think it's important for us to, using the voice of America, whatever, is to somehow try to tell people explicitly that people in Switzerland and Liechtenstein live very well. I think this is all the message that I have.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. With reference to what's happening in the Ukraine, I think one can say that 70 years ago, Tibet was in the same situation, and unfortunately, the world community could not come to Tibet's assistance. We hope the attention and focus on Ukraine will be much better, and the outcome will be better too. And for the record, I think I would like to take the opportunity on behalf of all Tibetans to express our acknowledgement and gratitude to the United States government for the attention and focus on what's happening in Tibet. Clearly, a tremendous amount of change has happened in Tibet for the better because there is attention from the outside world, and especially in the United States. And I think we especially acknowledge members of Congress who've taken the lead, and with your leadership at this time on the Tibet issues as well. I think I would like to say thank you on behalf of the Tibetan people.
Thank you. Ms. Bork?
Thank you very much. Just in closing, as you're talking about what happened 70 years ago, I just wanted to mention that the United States took a very principled position in support of the Baltic states against the annexation of the Soviet Union. There are some dissimilarities, but not really serious ones in my view, and it's really valuable for the United States to look back at the constraints it's imposed on itself over these decades, acting on behalf of Tibet and making the Tibetan exile government's position stronger in trying to reach some kind of improvement. And in that regard, I think a strategic focusing on Tibet as a strategic issue is vital. For the record, I will pass along to the staff a readout of a tabletop exercise that several of us conducted in 2019 about the future, the passing of the Dalai Lama, and how governments will respond at the time. Clearly, that is an exercise that needs to be repeated, and it would be something that I think members of Congress would find useful to think about being prepared for that eventuality, and what China will do and what the United States and its allies should do in prep. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for your testimonies. And I think this is a very important hearing because in our discussions on Tibet, some of the topics that we covered here today we don't go to, including the historical facts of the fact that Tibet has not been a part of China since ancient times. I think everybody here has disputed that very clearly. And look, our focus is on standing with the people of Tibet to protect their identity, to protect their history, to protect their culture, and to protect their human rights. And I believe that we in the United States, and Mr. Taetong, I appreciate your kind words, but to be honest with you, we're not doing enough. The world community is not doing enough. If we were, we would be having a very different discussion right now. And it's complicated. There are corporate interests involved, urging governments not to rock the boat because they're all, worried about continued corporate profits and, strategic issues involved. Nobody wants to rock the boat with China. We're very good at talking the talk. We're not very good at always walking the walk on these issues. And I think that's changing. And I really do. I mean, I look at the last few years here in the United States Congress. I mean, we have legislated more. We have created more policy on Tibet than at any other time. And, as I said, that, Tibet's true representatives are His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan government in exile, as recognized by the Tibetan people. And I think that should be our guiding principle here as we move forward, right? I mean, so it really, it's not up to what President Biden wants to do, or it's not up to, what President Xi wants for Tibet. It's not what, the president of France wants. It's what the Tibetan people want. I mean, that is and so any solution, any way forward has to be what the Tibetan people want. It can't be imposed by somebody who's not part of the Tibetan community. And I think there's a growing recognition of that. And the Tibetan government in exile is showing an embrace of democracy, which is really inspiring. I've witnessed some of the election. I've watched online people voting in far-off places, and participating in this process. It really is inspirational. But I've also met with families whose loved ones have been torn apart from them. People who don't know where their mothers or fathers are, who have disappeared. I mean, it is cruel. I mean, it is horrific. And and again, we are moving forward with additional legislation. We are encouraged by the new special coordinator in this administration. We will work with her to have her not only be a spokesperson for what U.S. policy should be, but working with the international community. I mean, I was particularly grateful that we are meeting. This hearing is at the same time that the World Parliamentary Conference on Tibet is meeting. I mean, this is not just a U.S. issue; it is a global issue. And if we care about human rights, this has to be a central issue. I mean, you go all over the world and you have these countries. Oh, human rights, human rights, human rights. Well, if you can't stand up to China on something like this, then let's stop talking about human rights. And to the Chinese government, look, I mean, if you want to do something constructive right now, you should re-enter the direct dialogue that you walked away from 12 years ago. This issue is not going away. And so I appreciate everybody being here. I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony. Without objection, I'd like to enter into the record a written statement from the International Campaign for Tibet, and an additional paper by Professor Lau. The record will remain open until the close of business on Friday, June 24th, for any items that members would like to submit for the record, or any additional questions for the witnesses. And with that, the hearing is adjourned.